Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 14 of the course. One more week to go. So we're getting close. You guys are making it through the semester. We're almost done. It's also Thanksgiving this week, so remember the announcement from last week that no discussion this week. No discussion question. I'm also starting to realize that I seem to be wearing the same uniform on Monday for every video, so anyway, I apologize if it's hard to distinguish between the week's videos because I'm wearing the same shirt from week to week. Okay, so last week I had you guys look at some articles about why the government talent pool is drying up, right? And they're drying up in the area of something called the fourth branch, which is what I want to talk a little bit about today. And the fourth branch is essentially what's known as the federal bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is a term that goes back to German sociologist Max Weber. And essentially, he said it's a way that a society or an organization structures itself to make sure that it's functioning in the most efficient way. It's certainly debatable whether our federal bureaucracy is set up to function in the most efficient way. But that's the general idea behind it, right? It's sort of this notion of like division of labor and specialization rather than the government doing everything by itself or Congress doing everything by itself. It creates all these agencies to carry out these different tasks. So going back to the origins of the federal bureaucracy, it started with Washington, right? And there are no official no official stipulations necessarily set out about you're going to create this particular agency, you're going to create this particular department. But Washington brought three with him. So Washington had the Department of War, he had the Department of Foreign Affairs, and he had the Department of the Treasury. So those were the first three agencies of the federal bureaucracy. Now, the Department of War is no longer called that. It's called the Department of Defense, which seems a little more politically correct. Department of Foreign Affairs is now the State Department, and the Treasury Department is still the same. But now it's expanded quite a bit, right? It's expanded to actually 15. So there are 15 agencies in the president's cabinet, and I'm going to try to remember these and explain them to you. There's a mnemonic device, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a memory device. It's some little jingle or something like that you can say to help you remember the 15 departments. And I tried this in my class. I remembered all of them except the Department of Education, which I felt like an idiot for. So the mnemonic goes like this: see the dog jump in a circle, leave her home to entertain every visitor. Okay, here they are. See the dog jump in a circle. C is state, the is treasury, dog is defense, jump is justice, interior, agriculture, circle, C, commerce. Leave her home, so leave is labor, her would be housing and urban development or HUD, home, health and human services, leave her home to transportation, entertain, energy, every, education, every visitor, veterans, and the final H here is Homeland Security. So those are the 15 agencies that currently make up the president's cabinet. Okay, so how did we get from 3 to 15, and really it goes way beyond 15, right? There are over 2,000 agencies, organizations, bureaus, whatever, that make up the federal bureaucracy. So how did we get from 3 in the beginning to 2,000 now? Well, it's just sort of tracked the evolution of the United States. Of course, when the United States started, when Washington started, the United States was much smaller. So there wasn't as much area to manage. It wasn't as complex. The economy has grown over time, so we've had to put in sort of these regulatory commissions, which are another thing that makes up the different agencies, like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, things like that. And expansion, expansion of the nation through the Louisiana Purchase, just gradually picking up territories over time, right? So, and things, of course, with the advance of technology have gotten a lot more complicated. So it's been a gradual process. And one thing that you'll notice is that there are certain periods throughout history that these, the development of these or growth of these organizations occurs, and they usually occur during times of crisis, right? So one of the first big ones was, well, of course, during the Louisiana Purchase, organizations were added because the size of the country doubled. But the Civil War was another big one, right? That's where we got a lot of agencies put into place. The Office of the Pension, which was essentially put into place to help veterans, Civil War veterans, after they got out, to make sure they received their benefits. Agriculture was booming at that time, so that's when the Department of Agriculture cropped up, pardon the pun. And then during the Great Depression was one of the next big steps, right? Because remember, that's when the government really took on a lot of the social service aspects that it has now, and sort of the New Deal policy, and the Public Works Act, which created the Civilian Conservation Corps, who was building projects during the Depression to give people jobs. So that was probably the largest increase. The next one was the Great Society Initiative that was put forward by Lyndon Johnson. During that time period, Kennedy instituted other organizations as well. NASA came about during that time. The Peace Corps came out through Kennedy. So it's just been sort of a gradual process. Perhaps the most recent big one is the Department of Homeland Security, which after 9/11, another crisis event, came about to sort of consolidate and coordinate all these sort of activities that play into national security, like customs and immigration. The Coast Guard is actually a part of the Department of Homeland Security. So as needs arise, these agencies come along to meet these needs. Okay, so how does one go about, and this is relevant to the articles, how does one go about becoming an employee of one of these departments of the federal bureaucracy, right? Well, in the beginning, it was very much based on appointments, so everybody, because a lot of these agencies fall under the executive branch. Because remember, the purpose of the executive branch is to enforce the laws, right? To faithfully execute the laws. And the way that the executive branch often does that is through the use of these particular regulatory agencies. So it used to be the case that the president would appoint, pretty much everybody who worked for these particular agencies. But that led to something called the spoils system, where essentially it's that old saying, to the winner go the spoils. Every time that a president would take office, they would sort of take, the incoming party would remove all the people that were working in that agency and replace them with their own people, right? To sort of reward people who had been loyal during the campaign, or their friends, or things like that. And obviously, that's not an efficient way to carry out, the mission of these particular organizations. So there was something called the Hatch Act that was enacted into law, which put certain requirements into place to get a job working for the civil service. There was a certain civil service test that they had to take, which is still in place for a lot of organizations, like the Foreign Service. You have to take the Foreign Service exam. So yeah, now it's much more based on merit. It's based on a degree of education, things like that. And that makes up the majority of people who are hired into the bureaucracies based on merit. But still, the heads of these particular agencies, who are called secretaries, their secretaries and undersecretaries are actually appointed by the president still. So in a sense, you still have the spoil system in place, at least at sort of the top levels of the organization. Beyond that, the undersecretaries and the secretaries have the authority to bring their personal staff with them. Typically, these guys are coming from other major businesses or major government organizations, and they have a staff, and they bring them with them and put them into place. And then the majority of the workforce is comprised of like lower level wage jobs. So that's essentially how people get into working in the federal bureaucracy. So what do they do? right? What does the federal bureaucracy do? I mean, we already talked about they help to execute the laws that have been put into place. And how do they do that? Well, they make policy, right? They're policy making institutions. And there are a couple of ways that they can make policies. One is informally, and the other is formally, not surprisingly. So if they're making policies informally, so first I guess we should back up and figure out what exactly a policy is, right? And remember, policies aren't limited to governments. Schools have policies, families have policies, churches have policies. All classrooms have policies, right? Your instructor has a tardiness policy, or an attendance policy. If you miss this many days, you get this many points taken off, things like that, right? So it's like a rule or a guideline that's put into place to help, guide certain behaviors and certain actions. So that's what a policy is. It's not necessarily official, but in the government, it can take on sort of an official stance, right? So, how do they make policies? The way that they make policies informally is through the behavior of their agents, right? So, the IRS, one of our perhaps least favorite agencies, but IRS agents can set policies informally by their behavior, by their judgment, right? They make judgments on a daily basis. I'm going to audit this particular person for this reason. I'm not going to audit this person for this particular reason. So, if sort of a group of those agents get together and sort of put that behavior or those judgments into place, then it kind of becomes a policy of the IRS, sort of perhaps an unspoken policy, right? But granted, it can those behaviors can come from the leadership structure. It comes down and says, I expect you to behave in this particular way, given these particular circumstances. But the formal way that the bureaucracy can make policy is through something called rulemaking. And what these agencies or organizations or departments typically do is that they make regulations, right? They regulate particular industries. And they have to go through this very formal process called rulemaking. And essentially it's very similar to the way that a bill actually becomes a law. All the interested parties review it. It goes to a committee for a hearing. It has to be submitted to the Office of Management and Budget to make sure everything is in line with the process and the way that the law should be set up. And interestingly enough, this is something that very few people actually know, is that as citizens, as individual citizens, if you feel like one of these particular regulations or rules that's being considered affects you directly, then you can actually, there's a website called regulations.gov you can go to, and you can search all the regulations and all the rules that are being considered at that particular time. And there's a place on that website where you can go and you can actually leave a comment, just like on any other sort of website. If it's a blog or something like that, you can leave a comment. But the interesting thing about this is that as a citizen, based on the particular laws that regulate how regulations are put into place, the government is by law required to pay heed to your particular comment. And it's not uncommon for people who make comments, especially if there's a coalition, to be called in to participate in one of these trials or hearings. So people often wonder, how can I get involved in the legislative process? Well, here's a very real way that you can do it, And if you're interested, you want to know more about regulations and how that works, the best place to go, and this is the best website for if you're interested in knowing what's going on in the U.S. government, is the Federal Register. And you can go to that website, and there's more information than you'd ever want to know about what's going on with these 2,000 agencies and these 4 branches. So I highly recommend that you check out the Federal Register to sort of, if you really want to be up to date, and you want to try to get a more objective view of what's going on in the government than CNN or Fox or whatever. Take a look at the Federal Register. But yeah, if you want to get involved in these regulatory processes, if there's one particular issue that really speaks to you, go to regulations.gov, type it in the search bar, it'll come up, and you can look regulation by regulation, and you can add your comments to that. So the thing to know about these rules or these regulations, when they're put into place, they actually carry the weight of law, right? So they have to be followed, else you're breaking the law. So we've seen that there are so many different ways that things can carry the weight of law, in the United States. Of course, a bill can become an official law, right? Presidents can issue executive orders like President Obama did last week with immigration. These agencies can create these regulations that carry the weight of law, right? And that's just looking at it at the national level. That's not even considering what happens at the state level. So you can understand why people have to go to law school for 3 years if they want to become a lawyer, because the legal system is extremely complex. So in some ways, it feels like you need a PhD to understand the legal apparatus of the United States. And I mean, heck, even I don't understand it all. Right? There's a lot going on. So yeah, it's very complex. So that brings up the question of accountability, right? We sort of understand how the executive branch is accountable to the legislative branch. The legislative branch makes the laws. They can impeach the president. Supreme Court checks the president to make sure that his actions are constitutional. The whole checks and balances things, right? We understand that. So the question becomes, who is the bureaucracy accountable to, right? So it kind of breaks down in 3 ways. Well, these agencies are technically created by Congress, and they're funded by Congress. So in that way, Congress, has quite a bit of sway over these particular agencies, right? And it's very common that Congress will form oversight committees to look, at the behavior of these particular agencies. Visibly, this happened with the IRS not long ago. Their processes were very outdated. They were sort of abusing their power in a lot of ways. So about 10 years ago, Congress ordered the IRS to reorganize the way that they did business. So they did, and that's when it became you became able to file your taxes online. That's when their website became more friendly, became more user-friendly. So Congress does oversee these particular agencies. The president, appoints the heads of these agencies. They do have to be confirmed by the Senate, but the president has that authority. So the president's sort of taking a top-down approach, right? He's putting the people to lead these organizations into place that he or she thinks, will carry out their agenda in the best way. And then the Supreme Court can rule certain regulations unconstitutional. So they all sort of have a say over it. Another really interesting organization, this is sort of the last thing I'll say, is that there's a really interesting interaction between the regulatory agencies and the interests that they're attempting to regulate. Right? So let's use the Federal Aviation Agency as an example. Right? I think maybe I've talked about this before, but it's true for this. So the FAA has 2 particular missions. The first mission is to ensure safe air travel, and the second mission is to promote air travel. Right? So they're supposed to regulate the air industry. So Delta, United, all these other companies, the union, the labor unions that make up airline workers, all these sorts of things. So on one hand, it makes a lot of sense, at least from the first aspect, right, of trying to make sure that air travel is safe. In that sense is pretty cut and dry. They regulate it in that way. But the second thing, where it's their job is to promote the industry, the airline industry, it becomes less clear, right? Because they're actually trying to promote, United. They're trying to promote Delta. So they want to make sure that that people are utilizing air travel. So that kind of maybe constrains their ability to sort of regulate some of this stuff, because they're trying to do that, right? And you have to remember that special interest groups are playing a huge role in the entire political process. They're providing briefs to Congress, right, on these particular issues. Oftentimes, they're supplying the pertinent details to Congress. Congress will pass a law, put a joint resolution into place that's going to control what the regulatory agencies can do. So the interest groups are playing a pretty powerful role over the agencies in that way. So it's very, sort of very complex system. Interest networks, interest groups, you know. So, um, so yeah, the interaction between the bureaucracy, between Congress, between interest groups, really fascinating. There was a theory called the theory of the Iron Triangle that sort of described this particular relationship, but a lot of people believe that it's outdated, right? Because there are so many players, involved in this particular process. It can't be described just on a triangular basis. So yeah, there's a lot going on in the federal bureaucracy, right? There are over 2,000 agencies. One question that I asked my class in person was, if you had to guess, which agency, which organization do you think would have the most employees? It turns out that it is the U.S. Post Office, right? They have over 1/3 of the federal employees who work for the bureaucracy are postal office workers. So that's the biggest one. One quick word about this question of, how the workers, the younger generation, are no longer interested in working in these particular jobs, right? So Light and Thompson, they talked about how pay is not keeping up with the private sector, but mainly they focused on, how once you get caught up in sort of the government bureaucracy, you kind of feel like you're stuck. You're living the office space lifestyle. If you guys haven't seen that movie, I recommend checking it out to sort of get a glimpse of what at least what a bureaucracy looks like today. So and then they pose some solutions. You can sort of like try to pay more. You can make it, where they're more upwardly mobile, things like that. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the work, right? And we have to remember that working for the government is a public service job. And, if you're trying to incentivize it to a certain degree by trying to keep up pay with, the private sector, which is impossible, and trying to provide all these perks, which I think is great, but you have to ask at a point, do you lose that public service mentality that defines the work, right? Because I think most people who join the government do it because they want to serve, right? And they want to serve in a particular capacity, whether it's protecting the environment at the EPA or, protecting the national parks for the National Park Service, whatever they think it is, right? Whatever calling they feel, right? And it's not about the money. It's about stoking that sense of purpose and that sense of mission. I mentioned in a couple of the discussion posts about a conversation that Steve Jobs, former CEO of Apple, had with Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Pepsi at the time. And Jobs was trying to sort of bring Ballmer to Apple because he felt like Apple needed more business expertise. Now, this didn't end up working too well for Steve Jobs because Ballmer eventually kicked him out, but that's beside the point. But when Jobs was talking to Ballmer to try to convince him, he said, look, do you want to sell sugared water the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world? Right? And that's the mentality, and Ballmer came to Apple, right? So it's not about the sugared water. It's not about the money. It's about changing the world. That's how you attract people to work for the government. It's a public service, right? You need to sell that particular mission. And you need to make sure that not only do you sell that mission, but once people actually get into place that people are continuing to talk about that mission and trying to show people how whatever job they're doing, which may seem menial, is related to that greater purpose, right? So, in my opinion, that's how you retain talented people in the government. Okay, so that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving. Next week, last week of the class, we're going to have a quiz. And got some readings posted for this week, so do check those out. Even though the discussion is not mandated, I do ask that you read the material. And final papers are coming up too. So if you guys have already gotten a couple of drafts to look at, if you guys want to send me a draft of your paper, I'm happy to look at that. If you have any questions about the requirements, please let me know. Happy Thanksgiving.